I'm your narrator, Kenji. Tonight, I want to share with you a story that's been quietly circulating in certain neighborhoods of Tokyo for the past few years. It's not the kind of tale that makes headlines or gets picked up by major news outlets. Instead, it spreads through whispered conversations between apartment hunters, real estate agents who've been in the business too long, and those who've lived in the older districts long enough to know which buildings carry their own particular weight. This story takes place in modern Japan, and one of those aging concrete apartment blocks that dot the landscape of Shinjuku. You know the type. Built in the late 70s, they stand like weathered sentinels among the gleaming towers and neon-lit facades that define contemporary Tokyo. These buildings house the city's dreamers, its artists, its quiet observers who prefer the shadows to the spotlight. Tonight's story centers around a young woman named Emiko. She was 28, soft-spoken in the way that many creative souls are, carrying herself with the gentle deliberation of someone who sees the world through a different lens, literally, in her case. Emiko made her living as a freelance photographer, capturing the hidden corners of Tokyo that most people walk past without noticing. The empty convenience stores at 3 in the morning, the way morning light filters through the gaps between buildings, the faces of strangers caught in moments of unguarded honesty. Like many people in their late 20s, Emiko had recently gone through one of those life changes that forces you to reevaluate everything you thought you knew about yourself. A long-term relationship had ended, not with dramatic arguments or betrayal, but with the slow, inevitable recognition that two people can grow in completely different directions without either of them being wrong. She found herself suddenly alone in a city of 13 million people, carrying a strange mixture of grief and relief that she couldn't quite articulate. What she needed, she decided, was space, not just physical space, but the kind of emotional breathing room that only comes when you strip away all the familiar patterns and start fresh. She wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere she could focus on her art without the constant reminders of the life she'd been trying to build with someone else. Most importantly, she needed somewhere she could afford on a freelancer's inconsistent income. That's how she found the listing for apartment 406. It appeared on one of those rental websites late on a Thursday night, buried among dozens of other options that were either too expensive or too far from the city center. But this one caught her attention immediately. The rent was almost suspiciously low for Shinjuku, even accounting for the building's age. The photos showed a small but clean space with hardwood floors, large windows facing east, and enough room for her photography equipment. When she called the number listed, an older man answered with the weary voice of someone who'd been managing properties for decades. His name was Yamamoto, and he agreed to meet her the following afternoon to show the apartment. During their brief phone conversation, he mentioned only one thing that gave her pause. The previous tenant, he said, had left unexpectedly. The way he said it suggested there was more to the story, but Emiko was too focused on the practical details to press for information. The building itself looked exactly as she had expected from the online photos. 7 stories of concrete and glass, with narrow balconies and the kind of functional architecture that prioritized efficiency over beauty. The lobby was small and dimly lit, with mailboxes that showed the wear of decades of daily use. Mr. Yamamoto was waiting for her, a thin man in his 60s wearing a rumpled suit and carrying a ring of keys that jangled with each step. As they rode the elevator to the 4th floor, he made small talk about the neighborhood, pointing out the convenience store across the street and mentioning that the train station was only a 10-minute walk. But there was something in his demeanor that suggested he was going through the motions, fulfilling an obligation rather than genuinely trying to sell her on the place. The apartment exceeded her modest expectations. It was larger than the photos had suggested, with good natural light and a sense of openness that many Tokyo apartments lacked. The kitchen was small but functional, the bathroom recently updated, and the main room spacious enough for both living and working. She could already envision where she'd set up her enlarger and developing trays, how the morning light would illuminate her workspace. It was during this mental arrangement of her future life that she noticed the door. Near the kitchen, partially hidden by the angle of the wall, was a smaller wooden sliding door. Unlike the other doors in the apartment, this one had been nailed shut, with several pieces of wood hammered across the frame in a way that suggested permanence rather than temporary repair. When she asked Mr. Yamamoto about it, he glanced at the door briefly before looking away. "Just a maintenance closet," he said. "Nothing important. Some old pipes that needed work. Better to keep it sealed until the building management decided to address the plumbing issues." His explanation felt Emiko was too eager rehearsed, but to secure affordable housing to question it further. The apartment felt right in a way that transcended logical analysis. Sometimes you walk into a space and know immediately that it could become home. This was one of those moments. She signed the lease that afternoon, paid the deposit and first month's rent, and arranged to move in the following weekend. As Mr. Yamamoto handed her the keys, he paused for just a moment, as if considering whether to say something more. But whatever thought had crossed his mind remained unspoken, and he left her standing in her new apartment with nothing but the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Moving day arrived with the kind of gray, overcast weather that Tokyo seems to specialize in during the transition between seasons. Emiko had accumulated surprisingly few possessions during her years with her ex-partner, and the process of relocating her life fit into the back of a small rental truck. Her camera equipment, carefully packed in foam-lined cases, boxes of photographs and negatives representing years of work, the basic furniture and household items that constitute the foundation of independent adult life. By evening, she had managed to transform the empty apartment into something resembling a home. Her cameras and lenses were arranged on a desk near the east-facing window. Her developing equipment waited in boxes, ready to be set up in the bathroom once she'd figured out the best configuration for her makeshift darkroom. A few prints of her favorite photographs were propped against the walls, waiting to be properly framed and hung. As darkness fell over the city, Emiko found herself sitting on her small balcony with a cup of tea, watching the lights come on in the surrounding buildings. There's something uniquely peaceful about being alone in a new space, surrounded by the gentle sounds of urban life continuing around you. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional voice from a neighboring balcony, the soft electronic chimes of pedestrian crossing signals. But as the night deepened, she began to notice other sounds. The building itself seemed to settle and shift in ways that older structures do, producing the kind of ambient noise that becomes either comforting or unsettling depending on your state of mind. There were footsteps in the hallway above her, the distant sound of a television, the occasional thump or scrape that could be furniture being moved or simply the building responding to changes in temperature. And then there was something else, a sound so faint that she initially dismissed it as imagination, or the interference of city noise filtering through the walls. It seemed to be coming from behind the nailed door near her kitchen, a soft, rhythmic scraping like fabric brushing against wood. The kind of sound that could easily be explained by settling pipes or thermal expansion, but which carried an oddly organic quality that made her pause and listen more carefully. When Emiko pressed her ear to the wall, the sound stopped completely, as if whatever was making it had suddenly become aware of her attention. She pulled back, heart beating slightly faster than usual, and decided it was time to set up her dark room. Work had always been her most reliable escape from overthinking. The bathroom was small, but adequate for her needs. She spent the next hour arranging her enlarger, chemical trays, and developing equipment with the methodical precision that photography had taught her. The familiar ritual of preparation helped settle her nerves. Soon she was lost in the meditative process of developing the roll of film she'd shot during her first week exploring the neighborhood. As the images slowly materialized in the developer's solution, she felt the satisfaction that never grew old. Each photograph was a small mystery revealed, a moment pulled from the flow of time and made permanent. Street scenes, architectural details, the faces of strangers caught in natural expressions. This was what she lived for, these quiet revelations that emerged in the red-lit darkness of her makeshift darkroom. It was while she was hanging the prints to dry that she noticed something odd about one of the photographs. She'd taken it the day before, shooting through her apartment window toward the building across the street. But there, in the corner of the frame, was something she didn't remember seeing through her viewfinder. A shape in her own reflection on the glass, standing behind her left shoulder. She examined the negative more closely under her magnifying loupe. The shape was definitely there, though indistinct enough that it could be explained by the complex interplay of light and shadow that occurred when shooting through glass. Still, it bothered her in a way she couldn't articulate. She made a mental note to be more careful about reflections in future shots. Over the following days, Emiko fell into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Morning coffee on the balcony, watching the city wake up below. Afternoon spent wandering Tokyo with her camera, hunting for those fleeting moments that spoke to her artistic sensibilities. Evenings in her dark room, bringing the day's work to life in chemical baths. But the scraping sounds continued, always faint, always just at the edge of perception. They seemed to occur most often in the early hours of the morning, between 2 and 4 a.m., when the building was at its quietest. Sometimes she would lie in bed listening, trying to determine if the sound had a pattern or rhythm. Other times she would get up and press her ear to various walls, attempting to pinpoint its source. The sound was definitely coming from behind the nailed door. Of that much she was certain, but its nature remained elusive. Sometimes it resembled fabric being dragged across wood. Other times it was more like fingernails tapping against a surface. Occasionally it carried an almost musical quality, as if someone were gently plucking the strings of an instrument. During her third week in the apartment, Emiko began to notice small disturbances in her daily routine, items that weren't quite where she remembered leaving them. Her camera bag moved from the desk to the floor. A roll of film relocated from one drawer to another. Her enlarger timer reset to 0 when she was certain she'd left it set for her standard 30-second exposure. Each incident was minor enough to be dismissed as absent-mindedness or the natural settling of objects in a new environment, but taken together, they created an atmosphere of subtle unease that grew stronger with each passing day. She found herself double-checking locks, making mental notes of where she placed important items, and generally becoming more vigilant about her surroundings. The building's other residents remained largely invisible to her. She occasionally heard voices in the hallway or the sound of doors opening and closing, but her attempts at friendly greetings were met with polite but distant responses. This wasn't unusual for Tokyo apartment living, where privacy was valued above neighborly interaction, but it contributed to her growing sense of isolation. It was during her 4th week that she developed a roll of film and discovered something that made her question her own perception of reality. Among the usual street photographs was an image she had no memory of taking. It showed her own living room, shot from the entrance looking toward the kitchen. The composition was careful, almost artistic, with the afternoon light falling across the hardwood floor in geometric patterns. But what disturbed her wasn't the photograph itself, which was technically well executed, but the fact that she couldn't remember taking it. She went through her notes, checking the frame numbers and exposure settings, trying to reconstruct when and why she might have photographed her own apartment. The metadata was consistent with her other shots from that day, suggesting it had been taken during a session when she was testing a new lens. Still, the image felt wrong to her, not in any obvious way, but in the subtle manner that something feels off when viewed from an unexpected angle or under unfamiliar lighting conditions. She studied it for long minutes, trying to identify what was bothering her about a perfectly ordinary photograph of her perfectly ordinary living space. That evening, she decided to call her friend Yuki, who lived in Harajuku and worked as a graphic designer for a small advertising agency. They had been close since college, and Yuki possessed the kind of practical wisdom that helped ground Emiko's more artistic and sometimes anxious tendencies. After catching up on the usual topics of work and mutual friends, Emiko mentioned her new apartment and the strange sounds she'd been hearing. She tried to keep her tone light, framing it as more of an amusing anecdote than a genuine concern. But Yuki, who had known her for nearly a decade, picked up on the underlying tension immediately. "Have you talked to your neighbors about it?" Yuki asked. "Sometimes these old buildings have shared ventilation systems or thin walls that carry sound in unexpected ways. What you're hearing might be coming from a completely different unit." Emiko admitted she hadn't really gotten to know her neighbors yet. The building seemed to house mostly quiet, working professionals who kept to themselves. She'd exchanged polite bows with a few people in the elevator, but nothing approaching actual conversation. "Well," Yuki continued, "if it's really bothering you, you could always ask the landlord about it. Maybe there's some maintenance work being done that he forgot to mention. These older buildings always have something being repaired or updated." The suggestion made sense, but something about the way Mr. Yamamoto had dismissed her questions about the nailed door made Emiko hesitant to contact him again. There had been something in his demeanor that day, a subtle evasiveness that suggested he preferred not to discuss the building's quirks or history. Instead, she decided to do a bit of research on her own. The internet had made it relatively easy to investigate the history of specific properties, and she was curious about her building's past. Late that night, she began searching through property records, news archives, and local forums where residents discussed their neighborhoods. What she found was mostly of minor changes, and the incident's kin dates, ownership, mundane information about construction you laid around that accummed any residential building over the course of decades. But buried in a local community forum, she discovered a thread from 18 months ago titled "Strange Incident at Building in Shinjuku." The post was brief and somewhat cryptic. A user with the handle Tokyo Night Owl had written about a neighbor who had suddenly disappeared, leaving behind all his belongings and a rent payment that was current through the following month. The building management had eventually cleared out the apartment, but not before police had conducted what was described as a thorough investigation. No details were provided about what the investigation had uncovered, and the thread had attracted only a few responses before dying out. But one reply caught Emiko's attention. Another user had mentioned that the missing person had been a photographer who specialized in portrait work and had lived in apartment 406. Emiko's heart began to race as she stared at the forum post. The coincidence felt too precise to dismiss. A photographer living in her exact apartment, disappearing without explanation, leaving behind belongings and pay-scrolled rent. She'd through the limited replies, searching for more details, but the trail went cold quickly. Most users had moved on to other topics, and Tokyo Night Owl had never posted again. She tried searching for news reports about missing persons in her building, but found nothing in the major outlets. Missing adult cases rarely receive significant media coverage unless they involved foul play or prominent individuals. Still, the knowledge that someone had vanished from her exact living space cast a shadow over what had been merely strange sounds and misplaced objects. That night, she found herself lying in bed with heightened awareness of every sound in the apartment. The familiar scraping behind the nailed door seemed louder now, more deliberate in its rhythm. She got up several times to press her ear against the wall, trying to determine if the sounds followed any pattern. Sometimes they would stop the moment she approached, as if responding to her presence. Other times they would continue for minutes at a time, a soft, persistent whisper of movement in the sealed space. During her 5th week in the apartment, the disturbances escalated beyond simple displacement of objects. She began finding her camera equipment arranged in configurations she hadn't created. Her enlarger would be adjusted to focus on empty space, as if someone had been using it to project images onto the wall. Her chemical trays would be filled with water despite being thoroughly cleaned and dried after her last darkroom session. Most unsettling were the changes to her photographs themselves. Images she had carefully composed and developed would appear in her portfolio with subtle alterations. A figure would appear in the background of a street scene where none had been before. Shadows would fall in directions inconsistent with the light source. Reflections in windows would show rooms that didn't match the actual spaces behind them. She began keeping detailed notes about each photograph, documenting exposure settings, development times, and the exact conditions under which each image was created. But the discrepancies continued to appear, as if her apartment itself was somehow influencing the photographic process. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late October. Emiko had spent the day photographing the autumn colors in Ueno Park, capturing the way golden light filtered through maple leaves and reflected off the surface of the pond. She returned home feeling creatively satisfied, eager to develop the role and see how the images had turned out. The camera was still recording when Yuki found the apartment 3 days later. Emiko had missed their planned dinner, hadn't answered her phone, and her worried friend had convinced the building manager to unlock the door. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance. Emiko's belongings remained undisturbed, her camera equipment neatly arranged, her latest photographs hanging to dry in the makeshift darkroom. But Emiko herself was nowhere to be found. Police arrived within the hour and conducted a thorough search of the premises. They discovered that the nailed door near the kitchen had been pried open, the wooden boards scattered across the floor. The small room beyond contained exactly what Mr. Yamamoto had feared someone would eventually discover. 12 mannequins arranged in a semicircle, their painted faces turned toward the center of the room where an old camera sat mounted on a tripod. The floor was littered with developed photographs, spanning what appeared to be several years of work. But there was something new in that room. A 13th figure sat among the others, wearing Emiko's favorite sweater and jeans, her long black hair falling naturally around her shoulders. The craftsmanship was remarkable, so lifelike that several officers initially mistook it for a person. In its hands, positioned with careful attention to detail, was Emiko's camera. The investigation concluded 6 months later with no resolution. Emiko's disappearance was filed among the thousands of missing person cases that Tokyo generates each year, most of which are never solved. The apartment was sealed, the building eventually condemned due to various structural issues that the city deemed too expensive to repair. But sometimes, late at night in the surrounding neighborhood, residents report the sound of camera shutters clicking from the direction of the abandoned building, and those who are brave enough or foolish enough to look up at the 4th floor windows swear they can see flashes of light, brief and rhythmic, as if someone were still taking photographs in the darkness. Some rooms aren't meant to be opened, and some faces, once captured through a lens, never truly leave the frame. That's all for tonight's episode of Urban Legends Unveiled. Until next time, remember that in a city like Tokyo, some stories are better left as whispers in the dark.